Hello, dear friends, and welcome to this whispered read-through and exploration of the Chronicles of the Age of Chivalry, which is the Plantagenet dynasty from 1216 to 1377. For those of you familiar with this channel, I think you'd agree simply looking at the title of this book alone was enough to pique my interest. If there was ever such a English gentleman ASMR book, then it is this one. I very much look forward to exploring the content within. As is always the case with these videos, this is the first time that I've opened this book, so I get to explore it with you. And it looks like we're in for a treat here. There's each part looks like it's following a king, but it looks like we've got interestingly named chapters here. So perhaps there'll be enough content for a part per video. So let's say today's part will focus on Henry III, the years 1216 to 1272. We've got a preface first. This image here is an astronomer with his astrolabe and two assistants. One of them has an abacus. Can I see the abacus? Oh, I'm guessing this is the abacus here. Is this what he's referring to? I always find it very interesting, this style. It's whenever you think of anything medieval. For me, it's these faces, it's these colours, it's this illustrative style. This is from the Psalter of St. Louis and Blanche of Castile in the 13th century. It does make me wonder, is this a particular style of painting that was ordained throughout the Middle Ages? I wouldn't be surprised if someone were to explore the etymology of this painting style and tell us that actually it was a distinct style that was from God or ordained in some way. But the year when this volume begins was a black year for the English monarchy. In 1216, King John had been defeated in foreign war and by internal revolt. Stripped of Norman and Angevin inheritance save Gascony, had been forced to surrender to an insolent baronage. I think that's all the information that we need now, because let's jump straight into it and explore the reign of Henry III. Overleaf, we're going to see the Plantagenet kings on the choir screen in York Minster. Wow. Now these are some faces, aren't they? We have Henry, we have Edward, the next Edward, and the third Edward. Now, Henry looks like he's seen some stuff in his lifetime. That is the face when you realise maybe this job isn't what I signed up for it to be. It's hilarious how that's been said in sculpture. These three Edwards seem incredibly contemplative, stern, strong. Yet they've done my boy Henry a dirty there, I think. I'd love to go and see that in person. So here we have Henry III, Part 1. Wonderful stained glass imagery here of Henry III. So he came to the throne of England in 1216 when he was only 9, and compared with his brilliant contemporaries, King Louis IX of France and the Holy Roman Emperor Frederick II, he cut a dull figure as a king. He devoted much of his energy to pious and artistic activities, and in particular to the lavish rebuilding of Westminster Abbey. Much of the routine work of government he left to his favourites, frequently foreign, which provoked faction fighting at court, and finally caused his barons to impose reforms upon him from 1258. This, however, led to civil war that continued intermittently until 1265, when Simon de Montfort, Earl of Leicester, leader of the barons who opposed the king, was killed at the Battle of Evesham. The events of Henry's momentous reign are vividly recounted by two St. Albans chroniclers, Roger of Wendover and Matthew Paris. The pro-baronial Waverley Annals describing the last dramatic years in the chivalrous history of William Marshal I. The epitaph on King John Henry III's father by the anonymous Barnwell analyst introduces the story. So it would seem then by this little overview that actually my slightly comical critique on what Henry was portrayed as in that York Minster sculpture overleaf actually held some weight to it. So laid low by illness, King John ended his days on the 19th of October. He'd ruled for 17 years, 5 months and 4 days. He was a great prince, but scarcely a happy one, and like Marius experienced the up and downs of fortune. He was munificent and liberal to outsiders, but a plunderer of his own people, trusting strangers rather than his subjects, wherefore he was eventually deserted by his own men and in the end little mourned. When King John was buried, the great men came together in council and resolved to send Thomas of Stamford to Devizes to bring from there the king's firstborn son Henry and all those that were with him. William Marshal went ahead of them and rejoined them outside Malmesbury on the plain. Ralph de St. Sanson, the prince's governor, was there, carrying him in his arms. The child, who was well bred, greeted William Marshal and said to him, "Greetings, I entrust myself to God and to you. May God help you to look after us well." William Marshal replied, "Sire, upon my soul, I shall neglect nothing to serve you faithfully, so long as I have strength to do so." All burst into tears. William Marshal liked the rest. Then they set out again for Gloucester. What I'm quite interested in already is this book is going to show us the history through the unique perspective of educated chroniclers, which we haven't quite covered in this channel yet. But what I find interesting is that it already reads a little bit like you'd expect a Reddit post to read in That Happened or something like that. Everybody cried, everyone burst into tears, it kind of sounds like, and then everyone clapped, if you know what I mean. So here we have Europe, or England and France rather, in Henry III's reign. So we've got England here. We've got the Kingdom of Castile, the Kingdom of Navarre, the Kingdom of Aragon, the Languedoc region of France, Toulouse, Gascony, Perigord, Agenais, Quercy, Auvergne, Poitou, Berry, Nevers, Burgundy, French World Domain, Champagne, Normandy, Brittany, Anjou. So the lands of Henry III were here, and in Gascony. Seems very interesting, doesn't it, now to think of this owning a bit of that. And all of these regions here were also promised to Henry III in the Treaty of Paris. Here's the head of William Marshal, that first Earl of Pembroke who we just heard about from his effigy at the Temple Church. And the Earl Marshal rose to eminence through his prowess with lance and sword, though here he unhorses Baldwin de Guisnes at a tournament in 1233. He's got him good there. So this is a continuation of that trek with the king. They deliberated whether to wait for Ranulph, Earl of Chester, or to proceed without him. Some were for waiting, others advised them to crown the king immediately, for no one knew what the future held for him. The latter counsel won the day. Then someone asked who was to dub the King Knight, who indeed, said someone, if not William Marshal, who among 1,000 men deserves the honour more than the rest. It was he who girded the sword upon Henry II's son, the young king. Not one of you rivals his greatness. It is he who ought to gird the sword upon this one, and so he will have knighted 2 kings. All agreed to this. The child was dressed in royal robes made to his size. He looked a fine little knight. The great men who were presented carried him to the monastery. Rich gifts were distributed when he was anointed and crowned. The legate Gualo, who represented Pope Honorius III, sang the mass and crowned him King Henry III, assisted by the bishops who were assembled there. When Henry was anointed and consecrated, and the service was over, the knights carried the child in their arms. A number of others lent a hand, who were not much help. He was carried to his chamber, where he was dressed in less heavy clothes. At this moment, just as the company was going to sit down at table, there came bad news. A messenger more foolish than wise told William Marshal in front of everybody that his castle of Goodrich had been besieged the previous left the matter at that for the night, and each man went home. It's all told very romantically, isn't it? So he's come to the throne in very difficult circumstances. He's 9 years old. Philip II of France, Louis, the son of Philip II, King of France, controlled the whole of eastern England, including London, and was recognised as king by the majority of English barons. So in the darkest hour, the Plantagenet cause was kept alive by the papal legate Gualo, and by these barons and ministers who ordained him there and then. Military victory was reinforced by political conciliation. Former rebels who professed allegiance to the young king were restored to their lands, and the political programme for which they'd been fighting, the Magna Carta, was conceded. So if King John had won the war with Louis and the barons, Magna Carta would have been ceremonially buried. As it was, William Marshall's government reissued it in 1216 after Henry's coronation, in a form slightly different than the original in 1215, and in 1217 at the end of the war. Then there was no going back. Henry himself reissued Magna Carta in 1225, which became the official text, and again in 1237 and 53. Kind of George Lucas levels of tinkering. The early years of Henry's reign therefore formed a watershed in Plantagenet kingship, limited by law, limited in its ability to exploit its traditional feudal sources of revenue, and limited in its freedom to act against people in an arbitrary fashion. Clause 28, which is still on the statute book, stipulated that no free man was to be outlawed, exiled, imprisoned, or deprived of his property, save by judgment of his peers or by the law of the land, has rightly been seen as a foundation of English liberties and a bulwark against tyrannical rule. So when William Marshall died in May 1219, Henry III was still too young to govern for himself, so the country was ruled by three men: the Justiciar, Hubert de Burgh, the king's tutor, Peter de Roche, Bishop of Winchester, and until his withdrawal in 1221, Pandulf, the papal legate. The central government faced a problem: its own poverty and weakness, because the castles, sheriffdoms, and manors controlled that should have been the king's were controlled by men who had served King John and claimed they could not be moved until the king reached his majority, and they siphoned off a good slice of revenues. So this continued until the end of 1223, when Henry was declared of age. So many castellans and sheriffs were dismissed on the orders of a faction led by Hubert de Burgh and Stephen Langton, the Archbishop of Canterbury. So then a power struggle lasted for 10 years. Men who'd been ousted from office found a leader in Peter de Roche, and in 1232 they ruined Hubert and returned to power. 2 years later, Peter himself was disgraced. Henry's minority was brought completely to an end in January 1227. He remained under the influence of great ministers inherited from his father until 1234, when Hubert de Burgh and Peter de Roche finally quit the political stage. Only then did his personal rule begin. So of course these must be the problems of entering into royalty or the monarchy at the tender age of 9 or under the age of 13 or whenever it was for majority rule to kick in, because I'm sure the people who guided you and looked after you enjoyed what they did and got a good taste of power, didn't really want to relinquish it. So the early struggles had a wider significance because Hubert de Burgh was an Englishman. He was insular, conservative and cautious. Peter de Roche was a Poitevin, which was cosmopolitan, arrogant and autocratic, and then many of the latter's allies were foreigners, like himself. In 1224, the greatest of these, the Norman Fawkes de Broet, had staged an inflated rebellion, so it was easy to depict the troublemakers of Henry's early years as foreigners who conspired to disturb the peace and undermine English liberties. Because this rebellion followed so soon after the war between Henry's supporters and Louis of France, it increased the sense of English identity and resentment against foreigners, a backdrop to his reign. So we have more of this chronicle. The next day after Mass, the Earl of Chester arrived. He greeted King Henry III, who received his homage and that of the other barons. Many of those who came with the Earl regarded it as unfitting that the others had not waited for him to arrive before crowning the king. But the Earl silenced them by saying that they had done the right thing by proceeding without delay to the coronation. Then they all took counsel together and deliberated on the choice of whom the guardianship of the king and the kingdom should be "By my faith," said one, "I see only William Marshall or Ranulph, Earl of Chester." "In truth, my lords," replied William Marshall, "I cannot accept so exalted a mission. I'm too weak. I am over 80, but you, Earl of Chester, make it your charge, and as long as I live I will give you all the help I can." "No, indeed, Marshal," said the Earl, "you are so fine a man, so upright, so respected, so loved and so wise, that you are considered one of the finest knights in the world. I say in all sincerity that it is you that ought to be chosen. I'll serve you and will perform as best I can all the tasks you wish to command me." Well, they love each other very much, obviously. It's a bit of a complimentary off, isn't it? Then the papal legate Gualo took William Marshall aside into another room with Ranulph, Earl of Chester, Peter de Roche, Bishop of Winchester, and some of the great men. They began to deliberate afresh, but they would never have managed to overcome the resistance of William Marshall had the legate not begged him to accept the regency of the remission and pardon of his sins. On this condition, he would grant him absolution from them before God. "And in God's name," said William Marshall, "if at this price I am absolved of my sins, this office suits me, and I will take it, though it weighs heavily upon me." The legate entrusted it to him, and the noble William Marshall received at the same time the king and the regency. He performed it well so long as he lived, but we lost him too soon for the well-being of England. So this is obviously a recounting of everybody at that very moment, and we've got a new update in 1217. After an absence of 7 weeks and 5 days, Prince Louis returned to England with a large and proud army. William Marshall was annoyed at his return, and he had all the castles he'd taken from him dismantled. When Louis learned that the castles of which he thought himself master had surrendered, he was displeased. Having assembled a large number of carters, sergeants, crossbowmen, and ribalds, he went straight to Winchester. In a little while he had restored the tower and the high walls with stone and mortar, and had the breaches repaired. He left the Count of Nevers on the spot, a cruel, proud man with a strong garrison. Subsequently he committed various excesses from which he was to be reproached, but I do not want to talk about them. Oh, come on, please do kiss and tell. What happened on the 24th of August was that the whole enemy fleet joined battle with the king's men not far from the Isle of Thanet. Many of their ships and some of the leaders of the French party were captured, but the rest were able to evade capture by flight. Many of the lesser men were killed, scattered in confusion. The enemy could not regroup. And from that day the cause of the king flourished while that of Louis declined. Then, with the forces of the king gathering near London, Louis did not delay to make peace such as fortune offered. Absolutely stunning building here, of course, that some of you may recognise as the Duomo in Siena. These high Gothic cathedrals were first built in northern France at the end of the 12th and beginning of 13th centuries, emulated in Italy as well as England, Germany and Spain. The Duomo, like other Italian cathedrals, was based on the early Christian basilica shape. They reflected the wealth and civic pride of cities in which they were built. In the 14th century in Siena, the citizens decided to enlarge their cathedral, but because of a combination of lack of money and the Black Death, only the new west front was built. Here's a wonderful stained glass window in Chartres Cathedral, depicting Prince Louis of France. So the 13th century, like the 12th, was an age of great cathedrals. Massive and echoing stone edifices, windows filled with richly coloured glass depicting scenes from scriptures and lives of saints, and exteriors bristled with pinnacles and fretted gables, and enormous doors were surrounded by the carved figures of more saints and apostles. A cathedral reflected a city's wealth and was very much a corporate enterprise. Yes, I would say that anything that is worth seeing from an architectural point of view usually is a cathedral in a city. If you have to see one thing, usually that city's cathedral is something of an absolute delight. From an architectural point of view, if nothing else, the sheer intricacy. Such beautiful structures. What else have we got here? We've got the Orvieto Cathedral in Italy. Wonderful. Very similar to that Duomo we saw in Siena, but without the tower. Here's the Toledo Cathedral in Spain. and the interior of Girona Cathedral in Spain, the classic features of a Gothic cathedral here. I would say for me personally, I don't know why, but I have been in my life hugely influenced by Gothic architecture, and it seems strange to say, but I like the way I think and the way I feel. Sometimes can feel very much in tune with Gothic architecture, and I don't know if I'm going down a rabbit hole here that I'm not going to be able to explain properly, but romance, ambition, vision, collaboration, innovation, creativity, it's all bundled up into these stunning buildings, huge undertakings of humanity. Of course, we've got Windsor Castle here as well, which still stands. I mean, Windsor Castle still looks exactly the same as that. Here he is, crossing the channel to visit his dominions in France. He seems to have taken a bathtub, which isn't very, king-like. Let's jump back into some of these chronicles. They're very interesting. 1224, Henry III, the King of England, when he had reached 17 years of age, in order that he might take the affairs of the realm into his own hands, took back into his own control many castles which for a long time had been held by both foreigners and natives of England. For he held these people in suspicion, fearing that they might do him great harm if their power as holders of castles endured any longer, as afterwards proved to be the case. One of these men, the freebooting Fawkes de Broyd, who had fought for King John, refused to relinquish his castles to King Henry, but his rebellion was overcome by Stephen Langton, Archbishop of Canterbury, and Hubert de Burgh, the Justicar of England. Roger of Wendover, a monk of St. Albans, records the firm measures enacted against libidinous priests. So in 1225, in that year, a decree went out from the Archbishop of Canterbury and his suffragan bishops. The concubines of priests and clerks who are in holy orders and who have church livings shall be denied burial in consecrated ground unless they have completely mended their ways or have done penance so earnestly that they deserve proper burial. These keepers of concubines shall not receive the kiss of peace, moreover, nor receive consecrated bread in church for as long as they keep such women either in their houses or openly elsewhere. If the women bear children, they are not to be purified after childbirth unless they have given sufficient assurances to the archdeacon or his official that they will go before the next meeting of the chapter to make satisfaction. They'll go before the next meeting. That sounds very sinister, doesn't it? Those priests in whose parishes such concubines tarry shall be suspended if they do not disclose the fact to the archdeacon, and undergo heavy penance before such a suspension may be lifted. Any woman who can be proved to have known a priest carnally shall undergo solemn public penance, as if she had been convicted of adultery, even if she is unmarried. A married woman guilty of this shall be punished for a double adultery in case such an offence, unpunished, should encourage other opportunities for law-breaking. Wow. It's interesting, isn't it? How seriously this was ordained. So the only surviving description of Henry III's appearance, taken by Rechange from the Chronicles of Nicholas Trevett, portrays the king as being of medium height and strong build, a drooping eyelid hiding part of the pupil. Henry is probably much the same height as his father John, 5 feet 6.5 inches, quite short then in today's standards, and his coffin at Westminster Abbey is the same length as John's. He lived to be 65, which was considerable for that time, proof that his constitution was sound. So for Henry, the duties of kingship were summed up in his coronation oath of 1220, that pledged him to maintain peace, dispense justice, and uphold the rights of the crown. He remained a product of the early years of his reign, when royal authority was weak and when memories of the Civil War of 1215-17 had nearly destroyed the Plantagenets were fresh. So at home, therefore, Henry's basic aim was to live in peace, and to that end he tried to conciliate his barons, even allowing them to develop their local power at the expense of his own. Just sounds like the poor guy was afraid and focused on survival, which is understandable, but he was more ambitious overseas, looking to reclaim the Plantagenet lands, invading Brittany in 1230 and Poitou in 1242, both fruitlessly, and in 1250s tried to install his young son Edmund as the King of Sicily. He couldn't raise neither adequate finances nor the support of his barons, which he needed for any effective action, and to most of his subjects such unrealistic notions were further proof of his simplicity. So the fact was that Henry was temperamentally more suited to the peaceful style of post-Magna Carta kingship. Not for him his father's hectic travelling and energetic government. In 1244, Matthew Paris noted that the king preferred the delight and rest of his palace of Westminster to a campaign in Wales, and he yearned for an easy life, indifferent to hunting and tournaments, antipathetic to the rigours of campaigns and soldiering, liked to spend comfortable weeks, sometimes months, at his favourite palaces, within a few days' travelling distance of each other in the home counties: Westminster, Windsor, Winchester, Clarendon, Marlborough, and the furthest north Woodstock. Like all Plantagenets, he had a fierce temper, but it was easily appeased, and descriptions of his meetings with Matthew Paris show that he was accessible, affable, courteous, and sympathetic. His piety brought him widespread respect. He gave alms on a grand scale, feeding 500 paupers every day in the 1240s, and also every day was said to hear Mass 4 times. From 1245 onwards, he spent vast sums of money rebuilding Westminster Abbey in honour of his patron saint, Edward the Confessor. It was popularly believed that the Confessor had ruled in peace, and for many years Henry was able to follow his example. So political tension, however, was always near the surface, partly because of the king's personality. The Osney Abbey chronicler described him as simpler, which is a difficult word to translate precisely, because at one extreme it could mean that he's honest or straightforward, and on the other it could be plain stupid. I know which classification we would tie it to this very day, and it just takes me back to that original sculpture that we saw at York Minster, what people may have interpreted as simple. So in Henry's case, the pendulum swung to both extremes. It was usually settled somewhere between the two, possibly at naivety. Henry, in short, found it difficult to calculate the efforts of his actions and was unable to discern what was possible and what was not. So in political terms, the lack of judgment was sufficient to nullify his many good qualities. We have a little bit more information here about Francis, who, a friar, who's credited with having been the founder and master of his order of Franciscans, who departed his life in Rome in a miraculous manner. He was well known because of his distinguished noble birth, and he shone brighter by far on account of his honest life, led a normal childhood, began to meditate more and more often on the changeability of the allurements of this life and of temporal matters, and to think incessantly of how those things which flow away in time are as nothing. Seems like quite an enlightened thinker, doesn't he? This he had perceived in the literary and theological studies he had pursued since an early age, and in which he was extremely well versed. It was an idea which led him to despise the instability of perishable matters and to yearn with all his might for the kingdom of heaven. He gave away all of his food to the needy. He had voluntary poverty. He got rid of his inheritance, put on a cowl and hair shirt. Francis slept in his clothes by night, used rushes for a mattress and placed a rock under his head for a pillow, content with only the hair shirt which he wore during the day as a blanket, and he travelled barefoot in accordance with the gospel, embraced the apostolic life, and fulfilled the duty of preaching on Sundays and festivals in parish churches and at other gatherings of the faithful. He was able to impress his words on his audience all the more easily because he stood disassociated from fleshly lust and drunken greed. This chronicler seems to be insinuating there that some friars and priests may not have been able to do that easily because they were lusty and greedy and drunk. Interesting observation. In order to carry out his salutary purpose, Francis, a true man of God, drew up a series of articles covering these other principles, which are most rigorously followed by the friars of the Franciscan order to this day. writing to Pope Innocent III, who was sitting in the consistory at Rome, and sought confirmation of his petition from the Pope, which he obtained. We're going to hear more about Francis on the next page, and then we'll come back to the rather fascinating topic of priests and their concubines. So Francis dedicated himself and his new order to the duty of preaching throughout Italy and other lands, but especially in Rome. The people of Rome, however, being hostile to all goodness, so despised the preaching of the man of God that they would not listen to him nor heed his holy exhortations. After several days of this, Francis rebuked them sternly for their hardness of heart. "I grieve deeply," he said, "at your wretchedness, for not only do you scorn me, Christ's servant, but truly you scorn him in me. To confound you, I shall go to preach Christ to the brute beasts and the birds of the air, so that hearing God's words of salvation they may hearken and obey." So he's going to talk to the animals instead, okay? So leaving the city, he found on the outskirts carrion crows, birds of prey, magpies, birds of many other kinds. He said to them, "I command you, in the name of Jesus Christ, whom the Jews crucified, to come to me and to hear the word of God, in the name of him who created you and delivered you from the flood in Noah's ark." At his command, the whole flock of birds settled around him and fell silent. For half a day, without stirring, they listened to the words of the man of God, watching him intently as he preached. When these extraordinary events had been repeated for 3 days in succession, and had become known to the people of Rome and to visitors to the city, the clergy and a great crowd of people came out to bring the holy man back with deep veneration. His fame began to spread widely throughout Italy, and with a short time the Franciscan order devoted to preaching spread throughout the world. At length the hour came for Francis to leave this world and go to Christ to receive reward for his labours. 15 days before his death, wounds pouring blood appeared on his hands and feet, just such a scene was seen on the Saviour of the world as he hung upon the cross. And his side also appeared so open and so bespattered with blood that even the innermost secret places of his heart were plain to see. What more can I say? Crowds of men and women flocked to marvel at this wondrous sight, among them some cardinals. Then Francis gave up his soul to his Creator. When he was dead, no marks of the wounds remained, neither in his side nor in his hands and feet. This holy man was buried in his own chapel at Assisi. Pope Innocent III entered him in the calendar of saints in 1228 and proclaimed that the day of his burial should be celebrated as his feast. And here he is, the man himself, St. Francis, painted by Bonaventura Berlinguero in 1235, one of the first altar pieces to be dedicated to the saint. Now, as a chronicle, of course, it's a fascinating tale. One of the previous series of book read-throughs, as you may or may not know, I recommend you check it out if you haven't seen it yet, is the 70 Mysteries of the Ancient World, which looks at events like this that have been chronicled through history and explores the potential archaeological or historical evidence that underpins these stories. Ever since I've combed through that book, I've had the same hat on when looking at things like this. I just wonder, let's imagine that this did actually happen, but it's been romanticized for the sake of the story. I mean, I wonder if the birds congregating around St. Francis simply did so because they were starved and expected this person to give him food. And maybe his hand movements in giving the sermons indicated that he was distributing seed or giving out some sort of food, and they were attentively waiting for the product. I wonder as well, with all of this bleeding and exposing of his body, perhaps he had some sort of leprosy or some sort of disease that exposed his body parts. Or it was a miracle. So I think that's a good point to end this episode. There is far more detail than I could have imagined within this book. I thought, based on the way the contents were laid out, it would be a relatively swift exploration, but it is anything but. There is far more juicy information in here than I could have hoped for. So I'll put a pin in this episode for now and look forward to the next for more life and times of Henry III. But until then,